America's dangerous move in Venezuela and why it could spiral out of control. Let me take you back to April 30th, 2024. That's the day the U.S. government, in a move that barely registered in the mainstream press, formally recognized Edmundo Gonzalez as the legitimate president of Venezuela. On the surface, this looks like just another chapter in Washington's long-running campaign to oust Nicolas Maduro. But if you've been following my work for the past 2 decades, studying how great powers stumble into avoidable crises, you'll recognize this for what it really is: a deliberate escalation with consequences that could ripple far beyond Caracas. I've spent years warning about the dangers of American overreach in Latin America, from the Bay of Pigs to the coup in Chile to the disastrous drug wars. And what I'm seeing now isn't just another regime change operation. It's a calculated gamble, one that risks igniting a proxy conflict in America's own backyard, at a time when the U.S. is already stretched thin by wars in Ukraine and the Middle East. Worse, it's happening with almost no public debate, no congressional oversight, and no clear exit strategy. So let's cut through the noise. The official story goes something like: Maduro is a dictator who stole an election, the Venezuelan people are rising up in protest, and the U.S. is simply supporting democracy. The White House has rolled out sanctions, frozen Venezuelan assets, and even hinted at military options if things escalate. The New York Times and Washington Post have dutifully amplified this narrative, framing it as a moral crusade against authoritarianism. And if you only read the headlines, you'd think this was a straightforward case of good versus evil. But there's a problem with this narrative. A big one. The data doesn't support it. The election results, while disputed, weren't the open and shut case of fraud that Washington claims. Independent observers, including the Carter Center, which has monitored Venezuelan elections for years, have raised serious questions about the U.S. interpretation of the vote. The opposition itself is deeply divided, with factions that range from pro-democracy activists to hardline exiles who openly advocate for foreign intervention. And then there's the why now? Why, after years of failed coups and sanctions that have only strengthened Maduro's grip, is the U.S. suddenly doubling down? Here's what's really: this isn't about democracy. It's about oil. It's about geopolitics. And it's about a desperate American foreign policy establishment clinging to the illusion of unipolar dominance in a world that no longer wants it. Let me tell you something the mainstream media won't. Venezuela sits on the largest proven oil reserves in the world, bigger than Saudi Arabia's. And for decades, that oil has been a strategic prize for Washington. But under Chavez and Maduro, Venezuela has drifted into the orbit of Russia and China. Moscow has invested billions in Venezuelan energy infrastructure, while Beijing has extended credit lines and become Caracas's largest trading partner. The U.S. can't afford to let a country with that much oil and that much strategic value fall completely into the hands of its rivals. So what do you do when a country in your sphere of influence starts playing for the other team? If you're the United States, you try to change the regime. And if that doesn't work, you escalate. But here's where it gets interesting. The U.S. isn't just relying on sanctions this time. There are reports, unconfirmed but credible, of back-channel talks between American officials and Venezuelan military dissidents. There are whispers of covert support for opposition groups inside Venezuela, including factions with ties to Colombia's right-wing paramilitaries. And then there's the military. U.S. Southern Command has quietly increased its presence in the region, with more naval patrols, drone surveillance, and even the deployment of special forces to neighboring countries. Now, let me be, I'm not saying the U.S. is planning an invasion. But the signals are unmistakable. Washington is laying the groundwork for a proxy war, one that could drag in Colombia, Brazil, and even Cuba if things go south. And that's where the real danger lies. Because this isn't just about Venezuela. It's about the broader struggle for global influence between the US, Russia, and China. And right now, all three powers are playing a high-stakes game of chicken in Latin America, a region that, for most of the 20th century, was treated as America's backyard. Let's out for a moment. The US has spent the last 3 decades trying to maintain a unipolar world order, where it calls the shots and no rival power can challenge its dominance. But that order is crumbling. Russia is resurgent in Eastern Europe and the Middle East. China is extending its influence across Africa, Asia, and now Latin America. And the US? It's stuck in a cycle of forever wars, economic stagnation, and political dysfunction. So what do you do when your global hegemony is under threat? You double down. You try to reassert control in regions you've neglected. You take risks. And that's exactly what we're seeing in Venezuela. But here's the US is playing a game it can't win. Not in Venezuela, and not in the broader contest for global influence. Let's talk about the military realities. The US has the most powerful military in the world, but that doesn't mean it can easily topple Maduro. Venezuela's military is battle-hardened, with decades of experience in counterinsurgency and urban warfare. The country's terrain in jungles, mountains, and sprawling cities is notoriously difficult to control. And then there's the question of outside. Russia has already sent military advisors to Venezuela, and China has deep economic ties to the regime. If the US escalates, it risks triggering a proxy war with two nuclear-armed powers in its own hemisphere. And let's not forget the lessons of history. The US has a long and bloody track record of intervention in Latin America, from Guatemala in 1954 to Chile in 1973 to Nicaragua in the 1980s. In every case, the results were the short-term gains for Washington, long-term instability for the region. Venezuela would be no different. Even if the US succeeded in removing Maduro, what comes next? A fractured opposition? A civil war? A new authoritarian regime even more hostile to American interests? But the military risks are only part of the story. There's also the domestic political dimension. The Biden administration is under pressure from both the left and the right on Venezuela. Progressives want a more diplomatic approach, while hawks in Congress are pushing for tougher action. And then there's Florida, a key swing state where Venezuelan exiles wield significant political influence. The administration's Venezuela policy isn't just about geopolitics, it's about votes. And that's the real tragedy here. The US is making a dangerous gamble in Venezuela not because it's the right strategic move, but because it's the politically expedient one. It's a pattern we've seen: short-term thinking, driven by domestic politics, leading to long-term disasters. So where does this go from here? Let's run through the scenarios. Scenario: the best-case outcome. In this version of events, the US and its allies successfully pressure Maduro into stepping down through a combination of sanctions, diplomatic isolation, and covert support for the opposition. A transitional government takes power, holds new elections, and Venezuela begins the long process of rebuilding. The US declares victory, and the world moves on. But this is the least likely outcome. Maduro has survived multiple coup attempts, economic collapse, and US sanctions. He's not going to fold under pressure now. And even if he did, the opposition is too divided to govern effectively. The best-case scenario is a fantasy. Scenario: the most likely outcome. This is the slow-burn crisis. The US continues to escalate: more sanctions, more covert support for opposition groups, more military posturing, while Maduro digs in. Venezuela's economy collapses further, leading to mass migration and regional instability. Colombia and Brazil, already struggling with their own internal crises, are drawn into the conflict. Russia and China increased their support for Maduro, turning Venezuela into a proxy battleground. The US finds itself stuck in another quagmire, with no clear path to victory. This is the scenario that keeps me up at night. Because it's not just about Venezuela. It's about the broader erosion of American influence. Every day the US is bogged down in Venezuela is a day Russia and China gain ground elsewhere. And the longer this drags on, the harder it becomes to de-escalate. Scenario: the worst-case outcome. This is the nightmare scenario. The US crosses a red line, perhaps a direct military strike, or a full-blown proxy war with Russian and Chinese backing. Venezuela becomes a failed state, with warlords and paramilitaries carving up the country. The conflict spills over into Colombia, Brazil, and beyond, destabilizing the entire region. And in the chaos, Russia and China exert their influence, turning Latin America into a new front in the global struggle for power. This isn't just speculation. It's happened before. Look at Syria. Look at Libya. Look at Iraq. The US has a long history of stumbling into conflicts it doesn't understand, with consequences that last for decades. So what should the US do instead? Let me tell you something: it should back off. Not because Maduro is a good leader. Not because Venezuela's government is democratic. But because the alternative is worse. The US needs to accept that it can't control every country in its sphere of influence. It needs to recognize that great powers can and should coexist, even when they disagree. And it needs to stop treating Latin America as a chessboard for its own geopolitical games. There's a better way. The US could lift sanctions in exchange for democratic concessions. It could work with regional partners, Brazil, Mexico, Colombia, to broker a negotiated settlement. It could offer Maduro a face-saving exit, rather than forcing him into a corner. And it could focus on stabilizing Venezuela's economy, rather than destabilizing its government. But that would require something the US foreign policy establishment has: humility. Let me leave you with this. The greatest danger in Venezuela isn't Maduro. It's the illusion that the US can still dictate outcomes in a multipolar world. It's the belief that military force and economic coercion can solve complex political problems. And it's the refusal to learn from history. The American people need to wake up. Because if this escalates, and it very well could, the consequences won't just be felt in Caracas. They'll be felt in Washington, in Moscow, in Beijing, and in every capital that's watching this dangerous game unfold. Informed citizens are the brake on government overreach. And right now, we need that brake more than ever. Now, what most people don't realize is that this isn't just about Venezuela, it's about the entire architecture of US foreign policy in the 21st century. The same playbook that's being used in Caracas was deployed in Ukraine, in Iran, in Nicaragua, and even in places like Bolivia, where the US quietly backed a coup in 2019 only to see the targeted government survive and grow closer to Beijing. The pattern is always the identify a government that refuses to align with American interests, label it a threat to democracy, impose sanctions, fund opposition groups, and then act surprised when the targeted regime turns to Russia or China for survival. It's like watching a bad sequel to the Cold War, except this time, the US isn't the only superpower calling the shots. Let me explain why this matters. The official narrative paints Venezuela as an isolated rogue state, a pariah that must be brought to heel for the sake of regional stability. But that narrative ignores a few inconvenient facts. First, Venezuela's government, for all its flaws, was democratically elected not once, but multiple times, including in 2018 and 2020, despite US efforts to delegitimize those votes. The Organization of American States, which the US often cites as an authority, refused to recognize those elections, but independent observers like the Carter Center and even some European Union monitors acknowledged that while the process was flawed, it wasn't fundamentally illegitimate. That's not to say Maduro is a saint, far from it, but it's to say that the US has a habit of declaring elections fraudulent only when the results don't go its way. Second, the sanctions regime isn't some surgical tool designed to target the regime's inner circle. It's a blunt instrument that has devastated Venezuela's economy, pushing millions into poverty and forcing over 7 million people to flee the country. The US Treasury's own data shows that sanctions have blocked Venezuela from accessing international financial markets, prevented it from selling oil, and even frozen assets belonging to ordinary citizens. In 2020, a report by the Center for Economic and Policy Research found that US sanctions were responsible for at least 40,000 deaths in Venezuela between 2017 and 2018 alone. That's not regime change, that's collective punishment. Here's the uncomfortable: the US doesn't actually want a stable Venezuela. If it did, it would have lifted sanctions years ago in exchange for concessions, as it's done with other authoritarian regimes when it suited American interests. Look at Saudi Arabia. Look at Egypt. Look at the countless dictatorships the US has propped up when it was convenient. But Venezuela? Venezuela is different because it sits on the world's largest oil reserves, and because it dared to nationalize its resources, defying the Western energy giants that once controlled them. That's the real sin, not human rights abuses, not corruption, but the audacity to assert economic sovereignty in a region the US has long considered its backyard. And let's talk about the opposition. The US has spent millions funding and training Venezuelan opposition groups, most notably through organizations like the National Endowment for Democracy and USAID. Now, I'm not saying these groups are all CIA fronts, though some of them certainly have ties to intelligence agencies, but what I am saying is that the US has a long history of picking winners in foreign conflicts, only to abandon them when they become inconvenient. Remember Juan Guaidó? The self-declared interim president who was recognized by the US and its allies in 2019? He was hailed as the future of Venezuela, a democratic hero who would restore order and prosperity. 3 years later, he was a political nonentity, his movement fractured, his credibility in tatters. The US backed him, then left him twisting in the wind when he failed to deliver. That's not democracy promotion, that's geopolitical theater. Now, you might be, but what about the Russian and Chinese influence? Aren't they the real threat here? And to that, of course they are. But the question isn't whether Russia and China are extending their influence in Latin America, they are. The question is why. And the answer is because the US has given them an opening. Every time the US overthrows a government, imposes crippling sanctions, or backs a failed opposition movement, it creates a vacuum. And nature, as they say, abhors a vacuum. Russia and China are more than happy to step in, offering loans, military cooperation, and economic partnerships that come with far fewer strings attached than anything the US or the IMF would offer. Take the case of Nicaragua. In 2018, the US backed mass protests against Daniel Ortega, imposing sanctions and calling for his ouster. What happened next? Ortega turned to Russia for military support and to China for infrastructure projects, including a controversial $50 billion canal project that would rival the AMA Canal. The US got exactly what it didn't: a more entrenched regime, deeper ties between Managua and Moscow, and a foothold for Beijing in Central America. Sound familiar? This is the paradox of American foreign policy. The more the US tries to exert control, the less control it actually has. The more it pushes, the more resistance it encounters. And the more it isolates its adversaries, the more those adversaries turn to each other for support. Venezuela isn't just a test case for US power in Latin America, it's a microcosm of a much larger problem. The world is no longer unipolar. The US can't just snap its fingers and expect countries to fall in line. And yet, the foreign policy establishment keeps acting as if it can. Let me be, I'm not defending Maduro. His government has committed human rights abuses, suppressed dissent, and mismanaged the economy to the point of catastrophe. But the idea that the US can or should fix Venezuela through coercion is a fantasy. It's a fantasy born of arrogance, of a refusal to accept that the era of American hegemony is over. And it's a fantasy that could very well lead to disaster. Because here's what happens next if this escalates. The US tightens sanctions even further, cutting off Venezuela's last remaining sources of revenue. Maduro, desperate and cornered, turns to Russia and China for military support, perhaps even inviting Russian troops or Wagner Group mercenaries into the country. The opposition, sensing an opportunity, launches another round of protests, which the government crushes with even greater brutality. The US responds with more sanctions, more covert operations, more rhetoric about democracy. And then, one day, a miscalculation, a US drone strike gone wrong, a Venezuelan military officer defecting to the opposition with a cache of Russian weapons, a protest turning into a massacre ignites a full-blown crisis. At that point, the US will have to back down and accept humiliation, or double down and risk a direct confrontation with Russia. Neither option is good. Neither option serves the interests of the Venezuelan people. And neither option makes the US any safer. So what's the alternative? It's not complicated. The US could start by recognizing that sanctions don't work. They didn't work in Cuba. They didn't work in Iran. And they're not working in Venezuela. Instead of trying to strangle the economy, the US could offer a path to sanctions relief in exchange for concrete democratic reforms, free and fair elections, the release of political prisoners, and end to censorship. It could work with regional partners like Brazil's Lula and Mexico's López Obrador, who have both called for dialogue and de-escalation. And it could accept that, for better or worse, Maduro isn't going anywhere anytime soon. That doesn't mean the US has to like him. It doesn't mean it has to normalize relations. But it does mean accepting that the era of regime change is over. The US can't afford another Syria, another Libya, another Iraq. Not in its own hemisphere. Not when the stakes are this high. The American people need to understand this isn't just about Venezuela. It's about the kind of world we want to live in. Do we want a world where the US acts as the global policeman, intervening wherever it sees fit, regardless of the consequences? Or do we want a world where great powers coexist, where conflicts are resolved through diplomacy, and where the sovereignty of nations, even those we disagree with, is respected? The choice is ours. But we have to make it soon. Because the clock is ticking, and the next move in Venezuela could very well determine the future of the entire region. And if we're not careful, we'll wake up one day to find that the US has stumbled into another endless conflict, one that serves no one's interests but the war hawks and the arms dealers who profit from chaos. That's not the America I want to live in. And I don't think it's the America most people want either. The question: will we have the courage to say so before it's too late? Now, what most people don't realize is that this isn't just a foreign policy debate, it's a domestic political tinderbox waiting to explode. The Biden administration's recent moves in Venezuela aren't happening in a vacuum. They're unfolding against the backdrop of an election year where every decision is being weaponized, every misstep magnified, and every escalation framed as either weakness or recklessness depending on which side of the aisle you're on. And that's where things get really dangerous. Let me explain why this matters. The White House is caught between two impossible pressures. On one side, you have the Republican Party now fully in the grip of its MAGA wing, using Venezuela as a cudgel to paint Biden as soft on dictators. Just look at the rhetoric coming out of Florida, where Marco Rubio and Rick Scott have turned Caracas into a talking point almost as potent as the border. Rubio, in particular, has been relentless, framing the administration's sanctions relief as a surrender to Maduro. And this isn't just posturing. When Rubio tweeted in October that Biden's Venezuela policy is a disaster and demanded the reinstatement of maximum pressure, he wasn't just scoring points, he was laying the groundwork for a 2024 attack ad. The kind that shows grainy footage of Maduro laughing while American flags burn, set to ominous music. On the other side, you have the progressive wing of the Democratic Party, which has been increasingly vocal about the failures of U.S. interventionism. Figures like Bernie Sanders and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez have called out the hypocrisy of sanctions that punish ordinary Venezuelans while doing nothing to dislodge Maduro. But here's the uncomfortable: their influence on Biden's Venezuela policy is marginal at best. The president's team is far more concerned with the Florida vote than with the squad's Twitter feed. And Florida, as we all know, is the ultimate swing state in a razor-thin election. This dynamic creates a perverse incentive structure. The more the GOP hammers Biden on Venezuela, the more the White House feels compelled to double down on hardline measures to prove it's not going soft. We saw this play out in April when the administration reimposed some oil sanctions after Maduro's government backtracked on election promises. The move was framed as a tough response, but in reality, it was a political calculation, an attempt to inoculate Biden against the inevitable attacks from the right. The problem? Every time the U.S. tightens the screws, Maduro responds in kind. Political prisoners stay in jail. Opposition figures get barred from running. And the cycle of escalation continues, all while the Venezuelan people suffer. Here's where the scenario projections get really ugly. If the election tightens, and let's be honest, it's going to, Venezuela could become a full-blown crisis. Imagine Trump regains the White House in November. Within weeks, he reinstates maximum pressure, designates Venezuela as a state sponsor of terrorism, and maybe even greenlights covert operations to destabilize Maduro. The Venezuelan government, in turn, cracks down harder on dissent, expels U.S. diplomats, and deepens its alliance with Iran, Russia, and China. Suddenly, you've got a proxy conflict brewing in the Western Hemisphere, with all the ingredients for a Cuban Missile Crisis 2.0. But even if Biden wins, the pressure won't let up. The GOP will use Venezuela as a wedge issue in the 2026 midterms, framing any diplomatic engagement as appeasement. And if the administration tries to pivot back toward dialogue, they'll be accused of selling out to a dictator. The result? A policy that lurches between sanctions and half-hearted negotiations, with no clear strategy and no endgame. Now, let's talk about the domestic consequences of all this. The US has already seen a surge in Venezuelan migration, with over 500,000 Venezuelans arriving at the southern border since 2021. That's not just a humanitarian crisis, it's a political one. The GOP has turned these migrants into a symbol of Biden's open borders policy, even though the root cause of the exodus is the economic collapse fueled, in part, by US sanctions. If the situation in Venezuela deteriorates further, that number could skyrocket. And if Trump wins in November, he'll use it as justification for mass deportations, militarized border policies, and maybe even a naval blockade to stop the flow of migrants. That's not hyperbole, that's what his advisors have been floating for years. But here's the none of this is inevitable. The US could choose a different path. It could recognize that sanctions have failed and that the only way out of this mess is through diplomacy. It could work with Brazil, Mexico, and Colombia to create a regional framework for engagement, one that offers Maduro a way out without humiliating him. It could accept that regime change is a fantasy and that the goal should be managing the crisis, not escalating it. The problem is that the political incentives in Washington are all pointing in the opposite direction. The media loves a good villain, and Maduro plays the role perfectly. The GOP needs a foreign policy boogeyman to rally its base. And the Biden administration, desperate to avoid looking weak, keeps falling into the same trap. The result is a policy that's reactive, inconsistent, and ultimately self-defeating. So where does that leave us? Right now, we're on a collision course. The question isn't whether the situation in Venezuela will get worse, it's how much worse it will get before someone in Washington decides to change course. And the longer we wait, the harder it will be to pull back from the brink. I've been doing this long enough to know that foreign policy crises don't happen in a vacuum. They're shaped by domestic politics, by media narratives, by the short-term calculations of elected officials. And right now, all of those forces are pushing the US toward a confrontation it can't win. The American people deserve better than this. They deserve a foreign policy that's based on reality, not rhetoric. But reality doesn't win elections. And that's the real tragedy here. The clock is ticking. The next move in Venezuela could come at any moment. And if we're not careful, we'll look back on this moment and wonder how we let things spiral so far out of control. Again. Now, what most people don't realize is that this isn't just about Venezuela, it's about the rot at the heart of American foreign policy. The same dysfunction that led us into Iraq, that kept us in Afghanistan for 2 decades, that turned Libya into a failed state, is playing out again. And the worst part? We're not learning a damn thing. Let me explain why this matters for domestic politics. Right now, the Biden administration is caught between 2 bad options. On one side, you've got the GOP hammering them on border security, using Venezuela as a cudgel. Every time a migrant caravan makes headlines, every time a Republican governor sends a busload of asylum seekers to Martha's Vineyard, it's not just a political stunt, it's a deliberate strategy to force Biden's hand. And it's working. The White House is so terrified of looking soft that they're doubling down on policies that have already failed. Take the recent decision to reimpose sanctions on Venezuela's gold sector. The Treasury Department framed it as a targeted measure to cut off Maduro's revenue streams, but here's the uncomfortable: sanctions don't work. They never have. The US has been sanctioning Venezuela since 2017, and what's changed? The economy is still in tatters, but Maduro is still in power, and the Venezuelan people are still suffering. If anything, the sanctions have made him more defiant. In 2019, after the US recognized Juan Guaidó as interim president, Maduro didn't blink. He just leaned harder into his alliance with Russia, Iran, and China. And now, with the US distracted by Ukraine and the Middle East, he's got even more room to maneuver. But the political calculus in Washington doesn't care about effectiveness. It cares about appearances. The Biden team knows that if they ease up on Maduro, they'll get hammered by the GOP as weak on communism, weak on immigration, weak on everything. So they keep the pressure on, even when it's counterproductive. It's the same dynamic we saw with Cuba for 60 years. The embargo didn't topple Castro, but no politician wanted to be the one to admit it was a failure. So we kept doing it, decade after decade, until the policy became a zombie dead but still shuffling forward. Now, here's where things get really dangerous. The 2024 election is looming, and Venezuela is becoming a wedge issue. Trump has already signaled that he'll use it to attack Biden, framing the administration as soft on dictators. And if the situation deteriorates, if there's another wave of migration, if Maduro cracks down harder on opposition figures, if the economy collapses further, Biden will feel pressure to respond. Not because it's the right thing to do, but because it's the politically expedient thing to do. Let's game out a few scenarios. First, the optimistic Biden ignores the hawks in his own party and the GOP's fearmongering, and instead works with regional partners to negotiate a gradual easing of sanctions in exchange for electoral reforms. It's not impossible. Lula in Brazil has been pushing for dialogue, and even Colombia's Petro has softened his stance on Maduro. But here's the: any deal would require concessions, and concessions look like weakness in Washington. The media would crucify Biden for legitimizing a dictator, and the GOP would use it as proof that the Democrats can't be trusted on national security. So even if Biden wanted to take this path, the political costs might be too high. Then there's the pessimistic Maduro does something reckless. Maybe he arrests another opposition leader, or cracks down on protests, or even, God forbid, makes a move against Guyana's Essequibo region. The US would have to respond, and the options would be ugly. Sanctions? Already failed. Military action? Unthinkable. A naval blockade? That's an act of war. And yet, I've heard whispers in DC that some in the administration are considering it. Not because it would work, but because it would make them look tough. But the most likely scenario is the one where already a slow-motion disaster. The US keeps tightening the screws, Maduro keeps digging in, and the Venezuelan people keep paying the price. The economy will continue to crumble, more people will flee, and the border crisis will get worse. And when it does, the GOP will blame Biden, Biden will blame Maduro, and the cycle will continue. No one in Washington will admit that the policy is broken, because admitting failure is worse than doubling down on it. Here's the thing about foreign policy: they don't stay contained. The longer this goes on, the more likely it is that something breaks. Maybe it's a skirmish in the Caribbean. Maybe it's a Russian or Iranian move to prop up Maduro. Maybe it's a domestic backlash in the US when the next migrant caravan makes headlines. But one thing is, the status quo is unsustainable. And yet, no one in power seems willing to change course. Why? Because in Washington, short-term political survival always trumps long-term strategy. The media gets its villain, the GOP gets its boogeyman, and the Biden administration gets to pretend it's doing something. Meanwhile, the Venezuelan people keep suffering, and the US keeps sleepwalking toward another avoidable disaster. I've been covering these kinds of crises for years, and the pattern never changes. The US stumbles into a conflict because no one wants to be the first to blink. Then, when things go wrong, everyone scrambles to assign blame. And by the time the dust settles, the only people who really pay the price are the ones who had no say in the matter. So here we are, once again, watching the same tragedy unfold. The question isn't whether the US will get it wrong in Venezuela, it's how much damage it will do before someone finally admits that the current approach is a dead end. And the clock is ticking. The next move could come at any moment. The only question is whether anyone in Washington will have the courage to stop it before it's too late. Now, what most people don't realize is that this isn't just some regional sideshow. Venezuela is the perfect storm of great power competition, energy geopolitics, and domestic political dysfunction. And the Biden administration, like its predecessors, is playing with fire while pretending it's just lighting a candle. Let me explain why this matters beyond Caracas. First, there's the energy angle. Venezuela sits on the world's largest proven oil reserves, 303 billion barrels, according to OPEC's 2023 figures. That's more than Saudi Arabia. And right now, most of that oil is either offline or being sold at a discount to China, Iran, and Russia. The US sanctions regime, which has been in place since 2019 under Trump and exited under Biden, was supposed to start Maduro's regime of cash. Instead, it's pushed Venezuela into the arms of America's adversaries. In 2023 alone, China imported over 400,000 barrels per day of Venezuelan crude, often at a 30% discount, while Russia has been helping Maduro evade sanctions through shadowy trading networks. The irony? The US is effectively subsidizing the very countries it's trying to contain by keeping Venezuelan oil off the global market. Meanwhile, American refineries in the Gulf Coast, which were built to process heavy Venezuelan crude, are now scrambling to find alternatives, often at higher prices. This isn't just bad economics, it's strategic malpractice. Then there's the military dimension. The US has been conducting naval patrols in the Caribbean under the pretext of countering drug trafficking, but let's call it a thinly veiled pressure campaign. In April 2023, the USS Nitsa and a British frigate conducted joint exercises near Venezuela's maritime border, a move that was as much about signaling as it was about interdiction. Maduro, never one to back down from a fight, responded by holding military drills with Russia and Iran. In June 2023, two Russian Tu-160 strategic bombers landed in Venezuela for the first time since 2018, a not-so-subtle reminder that Moscow still sees Caracas as a useful thorn in America's side. And let's not forget Iran, which has been quietly extending its presence in Venezuela through oil-for-gold schemes and military cooperation. In 2022, the US seized a shipment of Iranian missiles bound for Venezuela, a move that should have set off alarm bells in Washington. Instead, it was treated as a one-off incident rather than a sign of deeper coordination. Here's the uncomfortable: the US is sleepwalking into a proxy conflict it doesn't want and can't control. Every time Washington tightens the screws, Maduro turns to Moscow or Tehran for support. Every time the US flexes its military muscle, Russia or Iran responds in kind. And every time the Venezuelan economy collapses a little more, another wave of migrants heads north, fueling political instability in the US and across Latin America. This isn't a strategy, it's a slow-motion train wreck. So what are the alternatives? Let's start with the diplomacy. Not the kind where the US demands Maduro's immediate resignation as a precondition for talks. That's not diplomacy, that's surrender on installment. Real diplomacy would mean sitting down with Maduro's government, offering sanctions relief in exchange for verifiable electoral reforms, and gradually reintegrating Venezuela into the global economy. It's not pretty, and it's not perfect, but it's better than the current stalemate. The Biden administration took a small step in this direction in October 2023 when it temporarily eased some sanctions in exchange for Maduro's promise to hold free and fair elections. But the deal fell apart within months when Maduro reneged on his commitments, and the US responded by reimposing sanctions. That's the problem with half measures: they don't work, but neither does doubling down. Another option is to recognize that regime change isn't happening anytime soon and focus on stabilizing the country instead. That means working with international partners like the EU and the UN to provide humanitarian aid, support civil society, and pressure Maduro to allow more political space. It also means accepting that Venezuela's oil will flow, one way or another, and figuring out how to manage that reality rather than pretending it can be wished away. The US could, for example, offer to lift sanctions on Venezuela's state oil company, PDVSA, in exchange for a phased reopening of the sector under international oversight. This wouldn't turn Venezuela into a democracy overnight, but it would at least give the country a fighting chance to recover. Then there's the nuclear military intervention. Let's be clear, this is a terrible idea. The last time the US tried regime change in Latin America, it ended in disaster. The Bay of Pigs invasion in 1961 was a humiliation, and the Iraq War in 2003 should have cured Washington of its interventionist delusions once and for all. But that hasn't stopped some in the GOP from floating the idea. In 2022, Senator Marco Rubio tweeted that the US should consider all options to remove Maduro, including military force. That kind of rhetoric is reckless, dangerous, and exactly the kind of thing that could escalate this crisis into something far worse. The US has a long and ugly history of meddling in Latin America, and the last thing the region needs is another American-backed coup or invasion. The most realistic path forward is probably a mix of diplomacy, sanctions relief, and containment. The US needs to accept that Maduro isn't going anywhere in the short term and focus on limiting his ability to cause trouble. That means working with allies to counter Russian and Iranian influence in Venezuela, supporting opposition groups without expecting them to overthrow the government, and providing humanitarian aid to ease the suffering of the Venezuelan people. It's not a perfect solution, but it's better than the current approach, which is all sticks and no carrots. Here's the thing about Grant: it requires patience, humility, and a willingness to accept that not every problem has a solution. The US has spent the last 2 decades trying to reshape the world in its image, and the results have been disastrous. Iraq, Libya, Syria, these aren't success stories. They're cautionary tales. Venezuela is the latest chapter in that same sad book. The question is whether Washington will finally learn from its mistakes or keep repeating them. I'll leave you with: in 1961, President Kennedy inherited a CIA-backed invasion plan for Cuba from the Eisenhower administration. He approved it, it failed, and the world came closer to nuclear war than at any time since. Kennedy later said that one of his biggest regrets was not asking more questions before giving the green light. 60 years later, the US is still making the same mistakes. The difference is that this time, the stakes are even higher. Venezuela isn't just a Cold War proxy, it's a test of whether the US can still think strategically in an era of great power competition. So far, the answer isn't encouraging. The clock is ticking. The next move is Washington's. Let's hope someone there is paying attention.